Marcus Chen wiped the black grease from his hands onto his already filthy work pants and sighed heavily as the atmospheric processor finally hummed back to life. After 16 brutal hours of repairs, the lower districts of Imperial Station Zenith Prime were never kind to equipment or the people who maintained them, but today had been particularly harsh with 3 separate system failures that should have been caught during routine maintenance weeks ago. He gathered his tools with movements that spoke of bone-deep exhaustion and made his way through the service corridors that wound through the massive station like veins through a body. Somewhere during his trudge back toward the worker quarters, he took a wrong turn and found himself in a part of the station he had never seen before, where the walls gleamed with polished metal instead of exposed pipes, and the lighting was soft and warm rather than the harsh industrial glare he was accustomed to. His stomach growled viciously, reminding him that he had eaten nothing but a protein bar 14 hours ago. And when he spotted what appeared to be a restaurant through an elegant archway, he hesitated for only a moment before his hunger overrode his common sense. The place was nearly empty, which struck him as odd for what was clearly an upscale establishment, but he was too tired to think much about it. Marcus stumbled inside, and his eyes scanned the vast dining area, noting the crystal fixtures and tables that probably cost more than his yearly salary. Most of the space was cordoned off, and he could hear the murmur of conversation from somewhere deeper in the restaurant, but near the entrance he spotted a small table in a quiet corner with only one person sitting there. Perfect, he thought as he made his way over and collapsed into the chair with a grunt of relief. The young woman across from him sat perfectly still in what Marcus vaguely registered as some kind of advanced wheelchair, though his exhausted brain did not process the incredible craftsmanship or the subtle glow of neural interfaces that lined its frame. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with pale skin and dark hair that fell in careful waves around her shoulders, and she wore a dress of deep blue that seemed to shimmer when the light hit it. Marcus was too tired to notice that she had not moved or spoken, and he simply nodded at her in greeting before slumping back in his chair. Long day, he muttered to no one in particular, though he glanced at the woman. 16 hours trying to fix atmospheric processors that should have been replaced 5 years ago, but does station management care? No. They just keep patching and patching until the whole system nearly kills someone. The woman's dark eyes remained fixed on him with an intensity he did not quite register in his exhaustion. Sorry, I probably smell like a garbage compactor. Marcus continued, running a hand through his sweat-dampened hair. I took a wrong turn somewhere and ended up here, and honestly, I am too tired to find my way back to the lower districts right now. He looked around, hoping to spot a server or a menu or anything that might lead to food. You know what really gets me? He said, turning back to his silent companion. Nobody appreciates the people who actually keep this station running. The diplomats and the merchants and the nobles, they all just assume everything works by magic, and when something breaks, they act like it is some personal insult. The woman blinked slowly, and something changed in the interface on her chair, though Marcus did not notice. Take today, for instance. He went on, warming to his subject now that he had started. 3 different processors failed in the lower districts, and you know why? Because the replacement parts we requested 8 months ago got diverted to the upper levels, where some ambassador wanted his personal quarters to smell like whatever fancy planet he came from, and never mind that actual people need to breathe down below. Marcus leaned forward, his elbows on the table. And the best part? When I finally got the systems working again, my supervisor tried to write me up for taking too long, and I'm like, are you serious? I just saved 300 people from suffocating, but she'll let me work faster next time. 4. The first time in what felt like hours, something like amusement touched Marcus's face as he shook his head at the absurdity of it. All the woman across from him remained motionless, but her eyes had not left his face, and there was something in her gaze that suggested she was listening to every word with an attention that that would have surprised him if he had been alert enough to notice. "Sorry," Marcus said, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "I am just dumping all my problems on a complete stranger, and you are probably waiting for someone, and here, I am taking up space at your table." He started to rise, but found himself too exhausted to manage it gracefully and collapsed back into the chair. "Just give me a minute to get my energy back, and I will get out of your hair." Before the woman could respond, if she had any way to respond, Marcus heard voices approaching, and he turned to see 3 people in elegant uniforms hurrying toward the table with expressions of absolute horror on their faces. "Sir," the first one said in a voice that shook slightly. "Sir, you need to come with us immediately." Marcus blinked in confusion. "What?" "I just sat down, and I am sorry if this is a private area, but I was just resting for a moment." "You do not understand," the second uniform said, and his face had gone pale. "You are sitting with Princess Lyria Valkarth." The words took a moment to penetrate Marcus's tired brain, and when they did, he felt his stomach drop. He looked at the young woman with fresh eyes and suddenly noticed details his exhaustion had hidden from him before. The extraordinary quality of her clothing, the priceless neural interface shared the subtle but unmistakable bearing of someone born to the highest rank. "Oh no," Marcus breathed. "Oh no, I am so sorry, I did not know, I was tired, and I sat down," and the third uniform was already reaching for his arm to pull him away, when the woman's chair suddenly displayed a holographic message that hung in the air between them. The message contained a single word that glowed with soft blue light. "Stay." Everyone froze, and the 3 uniformed attendants stared at the message in disbelief, the 4 looking at the princess, whose eyes were still fixed on Marcus with that same intense attention. "Your Highness," the first attendant said carefully, "this man is a station worker who sat at your table by mistake, and we should remove him so he does not disturb you further." The holographic display flickered, and new words appeared. "He stays. He talked to me." The attendants exchanged uncertain glances, clearly torn between their duty to protect the princess and their obligation to obey her wishes, however unusual they might be. Marcus stood slowly, his exhaustion forgotten in the wave of panic that now gripped him. "I really should go. I did not mean any disrespect. I honestly had no idea who you were." The display changed again. "No one ever talks to me. They talk about me, around me, over me, but never to me. You treated me like a person." Marcus felt something twist in his chest at those words, and he looked at the princess, really looked at her for the first time, and saw past the royal trappings to the loneliness in her eyes. He started and then stopped, unsure what to say. The princess's display flickered. Once more, "Come back tomorrow. Same time, please." The attendants looked ready to protest, but something in the princess's expression stopped them, and Marcus found himself nodding before his common sense could override the impulse. "Okay," he said quietly. "I will come back tomorrow." As the attendants escorted him away with considerably more courtesy than they had initially shown, Marcus glanced back once and saw that Princess Lyria was still watching him, and for the first time since he had sat down, he thought he detected the faintest suggestion of a smile in her eyes. Marcus spent a sleepless night convinced that he would be arrested at any moment for his accidental breach of protocol, and he kept replaying the encounter in his mind, wondering how he could have been so oblivious and so stupid. But when morning came, instead of security forces at his door, he found a formal message on his personal communicator requesting his presence at the Upper District restaurant at exactly the same time as the previous evening. The message was signed with the Imperial seal, and Marcus stared at it for a full 10 minutes, trying to decide if this was real or some elaborate prank. In the end, curiosity won out over fear, and he showed up at the appointed time, freshly showered and wearing the only clean clothes he owned that were not covered in grease stains. The same attendants from the previous night met him at the entrance, though their expressions had shifted from horror to cautious suspicion, and they escorted him to the same corner table where Princess Lyria waited. In her remarkable chair, she wore a different dress today in deep green, and her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that must have taken hours. Marcus sat down carefully, feeling like he was navigating a minefield. Your Highness, I want to apologize again for yesterday, and I understand if you want to. The holographic display activated before he could finish. Stop apologizing. You did nothing wrong. Tell me about your work. Marcus blinked at the directness of the request. My work? You want to know about atmospheric processors? I want to know about everything, the display showed. I have spent my entire life in rooms like this, learning about history and politics and art, but never about how things actually work. Tell me how you fix the air. So Marcus talked, and at first he was hesitant and awkward, but the princess's evident interest encouraged him, and he found himself explaining the basics of atmospheric processing with growing enthusiasm. He described the filtration systems, and the oxygen generators, and the delicate balance of pressures that kept everyone on the station breathing comfortably. Princess listened with absolute focus, and occasionally her display would light up with questions that showed she was not just listening but truly understanding. Why do the systems fail so often? She asked at one point. Poor maintenance, mostly, Marcus explained. The station is old, and the systems were designed for maybe half the current population, but instead of upgrading everything properly, the administration just keeps adding patches and workarounds. And eventually something gives. That seems inefficient. The display read. That is one word for it, Marcus said with a slight smile. I have a few other words I use, but probably not appropriate for present company. To his surprise, the display showed what he could only interpret as a laugh. I know all those words. My tutors assume I cannot hear them when they talk among themselves. Over the following weeks, their meetings became regular, and Marcus found himself looking forward to them with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the opulent surroundings. The princess was brilliant, and her knowledge spanned subjects Marcus had never even considered, but more than that. She was curious in a way that reminded him why he had fallen in love with fixing things in the first place. He began bringing technical manuals and showing her schematics of various station systems, and she absorbed the information like someone who had been starving for exactly this kind of practical knowledge. In return, she shared insights about galactic politics and history that helped Marcus understand the broader context of the world he lived in. One evening, Marcus was examining her hover chair with professional interest when he noticed something that made him frown. Your Highness, he said carefully, may I ask who designed your chair? The Royal Engineers, the display showed. It was custom built for me when I was 7. Why? Marcus hesitated, then decided honesty was better than politeness. It is beautiful, but it is not very good. The display went blank for a moment, and Marcus worried he had overstepped, but then new words appeared. Explain. Well, Marcus said, warming to the subject. The neural interface is incredible, do not get me wrong, but the power distribution is inefficient. And the hover system uses 3 times more energy than it needs to, and the whole frame is designed for appearance rather than function. You can have better responsiveness and longer battery life and more precise control if someone rebuilt this from a practical standpoint. No one has ever criticized my chair before, the display read. That is because they care more about not offending you than about whether you are getting the best possible equipment. Marcus said bluntly, then caught himself. Sorry, that was true, the display interrupted. You are right. They treat me like I'm made of glass. You are not glass, Marcus said firmly. You are a person, and you deserve equipment that actually serves you instead of just looking pretty. The princess's eyes held his for a long moment, and Marcus saw something shift in her. Their friendship deepened after that, and Marcus started to forget that he was talking to royalty. Lyria, as she eventually insisted he call her in private, was simply the smartest and most interesting person he had ever met, and he found himself sharing thoughts and ideas he had never articulated to anyone else, but not everyone was pleased with this development, and Marcus began to notice that certain palace staff watched him with undisguised hostility. Supplies he requested would go missing, and maintenance requests would be denied without explanation, and once he found his personal quarters had been searched, though nothing was taken, the worst was High Chancellor Vex, whom Marcus encountered one day in the corridor outside the restaurant. The Chancellor was a tall, thin man with cold eyes and a smile that never reached him. The mechanic, Vex said in a voice like silk over steel. "How fortunate that Her Highness has found such an amusing diversion." Marcus bristled at the dismissive tone. "I am just visiting a friend." "Friend," Vex repeated as if tasting something unpleasant. "How charming. But you should understand that the princess's amusements are temporary, and when she tires of you, as she inevitably will, you will return to your proper place." "With respect, Chancellor, I think the princess can decide for herself who she spends time with." Vex's smile hardened. "You forget your place, mechanic. The princess is not like you and me. She is a symbol of the Empire, and symbols must be carefully managed. Your presence here introduces variables that are not helpful." "Variables," Marcus repeated, feeling anger rise in his chest. "She is a person, not a PR campaign." "Watch yourself," Vex said softly. "Accidents happen on space stations all the time, and mechanics work in such dangerous conditions." The threat was clear, and Marcus felt a chill run down his spine, but he held the Chancellor's gaze. "I will be more careful then." When he told Lyria about the encounter later, she was silent for a long time before her display activated. "Vex has always managed my life. He decides what I learn, where I go, who I see. He calls it protecting me, but it feels like a cage. Why does your father let him have so much control?" Marcus asked. "My father is Emperor of 1,000 worlds," the display read. "He has trusted Vex to handle what he calls the small details of family matters for years. I do not think he realizes how much power he has given away." Marcus thought about that, and about the way the palace seemed to operate, and a suspicion began forming in his mind, but he kept it to himself for now. Instead, he asked, "Would you like me to stop coming? I do not want to cause problems for you." The response was immediate and emphatic. "No. You are the only person who treats me like I have a mind. Please do not stop coming." "Then I will keep coming," Marcus promised. Vex can threaten all he wants, but he knew that things had changed, and what had started as an accidental friendship had now become something more complicated and potentially dangerous for both of them. Marcus had been meeting with Lyria for 3 months when she finally shared something that changed everything between them. Her display glowed with words that carried a weight he had not seen before. "I want to show you my medical records. No one outside the royal physicians has ever seen them, but I think you might understand something they do not." Marcus felt the gravity of that trust settle on his shoulders. "Are you sure? That seems like private information. You see me as a person, not a patient," the display read. "And you understand how things work in ways the physicians do not. Please." So Lyria transferred the files to a secure datapad, and Marcus spent the next week reading through decades of medical documentation in his spare time. The records were exhaustive and written in dense medical terminology that he had to research separately, but as he worked through them, a pattern began to emerge. That made him increasingly excited and then angry. The royal family's genetic condition had been labeled as an incurable degradation of neural pathways that affected motor control and speech, while leaving cognitive function intact. Generation after generation of royal children had been born with varying degrees of paralysis, and the condition was considered a tragic but unchangeable fact of the bloodline, but Marcus saw something different. His experience with maintaining complex systems made him approach the problem from an engineering perspective, rather than a purely medical one, and what he saw looked remarkably familiar. Human colonists had settled a high-gravity world called Takara Prime about 200 years ago, and within 3 generations, children began showing similar symptoms to what affected the royal family. The Takaran colonists were mostly poor farmers and miners who could not afford the Galactic Medical Consortium's expensive treatments, so they had developed their own solution using whatever resources they had available. Treatment involved targeted electrical stimulation combined with a crude form of genetic therapy that helped rebuild damaged neural pathways. It was not elegant and it was not comfortable, but it worked, and within 50 years the condition had been almost entirely eliminated. From Takara, Prime Marcus brought his findings to Lyria at their next meeting, and he could barely contain his excitement as he explained what he had discovered. The symptoms match almost perfectly, he said, pulling up comparison charts on the datapad. Your physicians have been treating this as a genetic dead end, but I think it is more like a bridge that got damaged and never properly repaired. The Takaran treatment was designed for a similar problem, and I think with some modifications, it could work for you. Lyria's eyes were wide as she processed the information, and her display remained blank for nearly a minute before words finally appeared. Are you saying I could be cured? I am saying there is a chance, Marcus corrected carefully. The treatment is not guaranteed, and it would be difficult and probably painful, and it would take months of work, but yes, I think there is a real possibility you could regain motor function and maybe even speech. Why has no one tried this before? The display asked Marcus, hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. Because the Galactic Medical Consortium considers the Takaran treatment to be primitive and beneath their standards. They would rather tell your family the condition is incurable than admit that a bunch of human farmers figured out something they missed. That is insane, the display flashed. That is politics, Marcus said grimly. But if you want to try, I can put together a treatment plan based on the Takaran protocols and adapt them to your specific condition. Yes, the display showed immediately. Yes, I want to try. Getting approval from the Emperor was another matter entirely, and Marcus found himself standing in the Imperial throne room 3 days later, feeling completely out of his depth. Emperor Cassius Valkarath sat on a throne that had been occupied by his family for 800 years, and he regarded Marcus with an expression that gave nothing away. My daughter tells me you believe you can cure her condition, the Emperor said in a voice that filled the vast chamber. A condition that has afflicted my family for generations and defeated the finest medical minds in the galaxy. I believe there is a treatment worth trying. Your Majesty, Marcus said, keeping his voice steady. I cannot guarantee success, but I can show you evidence that similar conditions have been successfully treated using methods that have not been tried with the royal family. And you, a mechanic, think you understand medicine better than the royal physicians. I understand systems, Your Majesty, and the human body is a system like any other. Sometimes the people closest to a problem cannot see the solution because they are too invested in their current approach. The Emperor leaned forward. And if you are wrong? If this treatment you propose harms my daughter, then you can execute me, Marcus said simply. I would not propose this if I did not believe it could work. Before the Emperor could respond, the royal physicians entered the chamber, led by Chief Physician Torvax, who regarded Marcus with barely concealed contempt. Your Majesty, Torvax said with an elaborate bow, I must protest this entire proceeding. The idea that a station mechanic could offer medical insight that has eluded our entire profession is absurd and potentially dangerous. Dangerous how? The Emperor asked. The treatment he proposes involves electrical stimulation of neural tissue and unproven. Genetic modifications, Torvax explained. The risk of permanent damage is significant, and there is no evidence it would work for the royal condition. There is evidence from Takar Prime, Marcus interjected. Over 5,000 successful treatments documented and peer-reviewed. Takara Prime, Torvax said dismissively. A backwater colony treating peasants with crude equipment. Hardly comparable to the sophisticated care we provide, Her Highness. Sophisticated care that has not helped her in 23 years. Marcus shot back. The throne room went silent, and Marcus realized he had just insulted the chief physician in front of the Emperor, but he was too angry to care. High Chancellor Vex stepped forward from where he had been observing. Your Majesty, I must agree with Chief Physician Torvax. This human has no credentials, no training, and no authority to be proposing medical treatments for the Imperial family. His presence here is inappropriate and potentially criminal. Criminal? Marcus repeated. I am trying to help. You are giving false hope, Vex said coldly. Which is perhaps the cruelest thing you could do. The Emperor raised a hand for silence, and everyone stopped talking immediately. He sat back in his throne and closed his eyes for a long moment, and when he opened them again, Marcus saw something hard and determined in his gaze. Princess Illyria has lived her entire life as a prisoner in her own body. The Emperor said quietly, Every expert I have consulted has told me nothing can be done, and I have watched my daughter suffer while being told to accept the inevitable. Now a mechanic comes to me with a possibility, however slim, and my daughter wants to try. He looked directly at Marcus. I will grant you 3 months. You will be given access to whatever equipment and personnel you require, and if you show meaningful improvement in my daughter's condition, I will know that hope was justified. And if there is no improvement? Marcus asked. Then you will be executed for giving false hope to an Imperial heir, the Emperor said flatly. And before you protest, understand that I am not joking. You are asking me to let you experiment on my daughter, and that carries consequences. Marcus swallowed hard, but nodded. I understand, Your Majesty. 3 months, the Emperor repeated. Do not waste them. As Marcus left the throne room, he heard Vex speaking in low tones to the royal physicians, and he caught enough to know they would be working against him at every opportunity. He had just committed to an impossible deadline, with his life on the line, and he had made powerful enemies in the process. But when he met Lyria later that day and saw the hope in her eyes, he knew he had made the right choice, even if it killed him. Marcus converted an entire wing of the palace into what he called a medical workshop, much to the horror of the royal physicians, who were accustomed to pristine, sterile environments. The space was filled with equipment he had requested, ranging from standard medical scanners to industrial electrical stimulation units that he had modified for precision. Neural work the team assigned to him consisted of 5 royal physicians who made no secret of their resentment at being ordered to take instructions from a human mechanic. Chief Physician Torvax visited regularly to observe, and Marcus could feel the man's disapproval radiating across the room like heat from a furnace. Illyria was brought to the workshop every morning at dawn, and the first week was spent establishing baseline readings and calibrating the equipment to her specific neural patterns. Marcus worked 18-hour days cross-referencing the Takaran protocols with Lyria's medical history and making adjustments to account for the differences in her condition. This is madness, one of the physicians muttered as Marcus set up the electrical stimulation array. We are torturing the princess based on the theories of a mechanic. If you have a better idea, I am listening, Marcus said without looking up from his work. Otherwise, either help or get out of my way. The actual treatment began in the 2nd week, and it was worse than Marcus had prepared for. The electrical stimulation required to activate dormant neural pathways caused Lyria intense pain, and even though they used every pain management technique available, she would emerge from each session trembling and exhausted. Genetic therapy was administered through a series of injections that made her violently ill. And Marcus spent hours holding a basin while she vomited and apologizing over and over for putting her through this. "You can stop anytime," he told her after a particularly brutal session. "I will explain to your father that it was my decision, and I will face the consequences." Lyria's display flickered weakly. "No, keep going. I have lived in this body for 23 years, and I am willing to suffer for 3 months if there is even a chance of freedom." So they continued, and Marcus pushed both of them past limits he had not known existed. He slept in the workshop, most nights catching a few hours on a cot between treatment sessions and monitoring Lyria's progress through the night. The palace watched with morbid fascination as the deadline approached and whispers filled the corridors about the human who was either performing a miracle or slowly killing the princess. Betting pools were established on whether Marcus would survive the 3 months, and the odds were not in his favor. High Chancellor Vex did everything in his power to sabotage the effort without being obvious about it. Equipment would mysteriously malfunction, requiring hours of repairs, and supplies would be delayed or delivered in damaged condition. Twice Marcus caught one of the physicians deliberately entering incorrect calibration data, and after that, he started triple-checking everything himself. "Why are you fighting this so hard?" Marcus confronted Torvax after discovering the physician had tried to reduce the treatment intensity without authorization. "If this works, Lyria gets her life back, and you can claim credit for supervising the breakthrough." "If this works," Torvax said coldly, "it proves that generations of my predecessors were wrong, and that the Galactic Medical Consortium has been lying to the royal family for centuries. Do you understand what that would do to our credibility? So you would rather let her suffer than admit you might have missed something?" Marcus asked incredulously. "I would rather maintain the integrity of galactic medicine than validate the primitive guesswork of humans," Torvax replied, and walked away. Marcus realized then that he was not just fighting to save Lyria, but against an entire system that valued its own prestige more than the people it was supposed to serve, and the realization made him angrier than anything Vex had done. As the 8th week began, Marcus started documenting strange patterns in the palace's historical medical records. He had been granted access to the full Imperial archives as part of his research, and what he found made his blood run cold. The royal family's genetic condition had first appeared approximately 400 years ago in Emperor Maltos III and his children. Before that, there was no record of any such condition in the bloodline. Medical records from that period showed that a new royal physician had been appointed just before the condition emerged, and that physician had pioneered a series of preventive genetic treatments that were supposed to strengthen the royal bloodline. But when Marcus traced the genetic markers of the condition backward, he found something impossible to ignore. The mutation that caused the neural degradation had not occurred naturally, but had been deliberately introduced through those early genetic treatments. Someone had intentionally crippled the royal family 400 years ago, and every generation since had been born into suffering that could have been prevented. Marcus spent 3 sleepless nights verifying his findings and tracing the conspiracy forward through time. And what he discovered was a carefully maintained system of dependence. The royal physicians had complete control over the health and well-being of the imperial family, and by keeping them partially disabled, they ensured their own indispensability. High Chancellor Vex's family had served in the imperial court for 11 generations, always in positions of managing the care of disabled royals, and the more Marcus dug, the more connections he found between the chancellors and the chief physicians going back centuries. Brought his findings to Lyria during a treatment session and watched her eyes as she read through the evidence. "They did this to us on purpose," her display finally read, and there was a quality to the words that suggested she was screaming inside. 400 years of suffering, and it was all deliberate. "I think so," Marcus said quietly. "I think your family has been kept weak so that others could maintain power through managing your care. What do we do?" The display asked. Marcus looked at the deadline calendar on the wall showing 6 weeks remaining. We have two choices. I can focus everything on healing you and bring this evidence to your father after the deadline, or I can investigate further now and risk not having enough time to show results. Can we do both? Lyria asked. I do not know, Marcus admitted. I am already working at my limit. Lyria was silent for a long time, and then her display showed words that made Marcus's decision for him. Healing me only saves one person, but exposing this saves every royal child who will be born after me. We have to do both. So Marcus began working 20-hour days, splitting his time between treatment sessions and secret investigations into the conspiracy. He lost weight and developed a tremor in his hands from exhaustion, but he kept pushing because Lyria was enduring far worse and never complained. At the 10-week mark, disaster struck. Lyria suffered a severe seizure during a treatment session, and for 3 terrifying hours Marcus thought he had killed her. The royal physicians took over and stabilized her condition, but Chief Physician Torvax immediately called for the cessation of all treatment. This proves the treatment is too dangerous, Torvax declared to Emperor Cassius, who had rushed to the medical wing. We must stop before permanent damage occurs. Marcus stood covered in sweat and shaking with adrenaline. The seizure was caused by a medication interaction. Someone gave her a sedative that should never be combined with the genetic therapy. Are you accusing my staff of negligence? Torvax demanded. I am accusing someone of sabotage, Marcus said flatly. The Emperor looked between them and then at his daughter, who lay unconscious on the medical bed. Explain. Marcus pulled up the medication logs and pointed to an entry from earlier that morning. This sedative was administered 3 hours before the treatment session, and it is contraindicated with the genetic therapy. I specifically instructed everyone that Lyria was to receive no medications without my approval. That entry shows my authorization. One of the physicians protested, but his face had gone pale. Then either you did not read the contraindication warnings, or you did it deliberately, Marcus said. Either way, it nearly killed her. The Emperor's expression was cold enough to freeze atmosphere. Everyone except Marcus leave now. The physicians filed out, and once they were alone, the Emperor approached his daughter's bedside. Can she survive more of this treatment? Yes, Marcus said. Once the sedative clears her system, we can continue. But Your Majesty, I think the sabotage will only get worse as we get closer to the deadline. Then you will have personal guards present at all sessions, the Emperor said, and all medications will be cleared through me directly. Continue the treatment. At the 11-week mark, with only 1 month remaining before his execution, Lyria's right index finger moved, and it was barely a twitch, lasting less than a second, but it was voluntary and controlled, and it was real Marcus. Watched it happen and felt tears streaming down his face as the entire medical team went silent and Lyria's eyes filled with hope and determination. The final 3 weeks passed in a blur of treatment sessions and late-night investigation as Marcus raced against the deadline that would either vindicate him or end his life. Lyria's progress accelerated after the first voluntary movement, and soon she could move her entire hand in controlled gestures, though the effort left her exhausted. Marcus spent every spare moment compiling evidence of the conspiracy, and what he found was staggering in its scope. The systematic crippling of the royal family had been maintained through falsified research and suppressed treatments and financial arrangements that enriched the families of those who kept the secret. Chancellor Vex had personally blocked 17 different research proposals over the past 30 years that might have led to effective treatments, and he had done so while accepting substantial payments from pharmaceutical companies that profited from selling ineffective medications. To the royal family, we present this on deadline day, Marcus told Lyria as they reviewed the evidence together. When the whole court is gathered, and they cannot suppress it quietly, Vex will try to have you killed before then, Lyria pointed out, and her display showed concern. Probably. Marcus agreed. But your father's guards are watching me now, and Vex cannot make a move without being obvious about it. I wish I could stand beside you when we reveal this. Her display read Marcus smiled. You will. We have 3 more weeks. They increased the intensity of the treatment, pushing Lyria to her absolute limits, and Marcus designed a specialized walker that would provide support while allowing her to practice using her recovering muscles. The physical therapy sessions were brutal, and more than once Lyria collapsed from exhaustion, but she refused to quit. My ancestors suffered for 400 years. Her display showed after a particularly difficult session. I can handle 3 weeks. On the morning of the deadline, the Imperial court gathered in the Grand Hall where the Emperor held formal ceremonies. Every noble and official of significance was present, including High Chancellor Vex, who watched the proceedings with barely concealed satisfaction. Marcus stood in an antechamber, preparing himself for what was to come and trying not to think about the execution platform that had been erected in the palace courtyard just in Lyria was brought in on her hover chair, and she caught Marcus's eye, and her display showed a simple message. Together. Together, Marcus agreed. They entered the Grand Hall side by side, and the assembled court fell silent as the Emperor rose from his throne. 3 months ago, I granted this human mechanic permission to attempt an experimental treatment on my daughter, Emperor Cassius announced, and his voice carried through the vast space. The deadline I set has arrived, and now we will see if hope was justified or if it was cruelly misplaced. High Chancellor Vex stepped forward. Your Majesty, if I may speak, the court has witnessed no improvement in the princess's condition over these months, and many, including our chief physicians, believe the treatment has been harmful. I urge you to end this charade and carry out the agreed-upon consequences. The princess has shown measurable improvement. Marcus interjected, and I can demonstrate that now, if permitted. Measurable improvement. Vex scoffed. What improvement? She remains in her chair, unable to move or speak, just as she has always been. Marcus turned to Lyria and nodded. This was the moment they had been preparing for, and everything depended on what happened. Next, Lyria's hover chair descended to floor level, and Marcus brought forward the walker they had designed together. The court watched in confused silence as Marcus helped position the walker in front of Lyria, and slowly, with tremendous effort and visible strain, Lyria's hands gripped the walker's handles, and she pushed herself up from the chair. The Grand Hall erupted in shocked gasps and exclamations as Princess Lyria stood on her own feet for the first time in her life. She was shaking, and Marcus could see the immense concentration on her face, but she was standing, and the walker supported her as she took one trembling step forward, then another and another. The court had gone completely silent, watching in awe as their princess, who they had believed would never walk, crossed the space between herself and her father's throne in slow, determined steps. Emperor Cassius had risen and was descending the throne steps, and when Lyria reached him, he took her hands. In his, and Marcus saw tears streaming down the Emperor's face, but Lyria was not finished, and with Marcus's help she turned to face the court, and her throat worked as she forced air through vocal cords that had never been used. Father, she said, and her voice was rough and uncertain but unmistakably real. There is something you must know. The Emperor looked at her with wonder. Anything, my daughter. Lyria's display activated, showing the compiled evidence while she spoke aloud in halting words. 400 years ago, someone poisoned our bloodline on purpose. The court exploded into chaos as the evidence played on holographic displays throughout the hall, showing the falsified research and suppressed treatments and the conspiracy that had maintained the royal family suffering. For generations, High Chancellor Vex's face had gone white. This is absurd. Lies fabricated by this human to what? Marcus interrupted. I was facing execution. Why would I risk making enemies of the most powerful people in the Empire unless I had proof? The evidence is fabricated, Vex insisted. But his voice lacked conviction. Emperor Cassius raised his hand, and the hall fell silent. These are serious accusations against some of the Empire's most trusted officials. What proof do you offer beyond documents? The genetic markers, Your Majesty, Marcus explained. The mutation that causes the royal condition is not natural, and it appears in the bloodline at exactly the time that preventive genetic treatments were introduced 400 years ago. Any qualified geneticist can verify this independently. The Emperor gestured to the royal physicians. Chief Physician Torvax, can you verify or refute these claims? Torvax stood frozen, and Marcus saw calculation in his eyes as the physician weighed his options. Your Majesty, I would need time to conduct a thorough analysis. How much time? The Emperor demanded. Several months at least. That is convenient, Marcus said. Several months to fabricate an alternative explanation or destroy evidence. You forget. Your place, human, Torvax snapped. My place, Marcus repeated and stepped forward. My place is standing here after accomplishing what you claimed was impossible because I treated the princess like a person instead of a symbol, and I looked at her condition as a problem to solve instead of a source of prestige and income. He turned to address the full court. The Galactic Medical Consortium has been lying to the royal family for centuries, and they, chancellors, have been maintaining that lie because it gave them power. And the tragedy is that hundreds of people have suffered and died when the cure existed, all along on a human farming colony that nobody considered worth studying. The hall erupted again, and the Emperor had to call for order. When silence finally returned, he looked at Vex with an expression like carved stone. High Chancellor Vex, your family has served mine for 11 generations, Emperor Cassius said quietly. If these accusations are proven true that service has been built on betrayal and suffering, you were stripped of rank pending investigation and confined to quarters. Your Majesty, Vex started, but guards were already moving to escort him away. The Emperor turned to Torvax. And you, Chief Physician, are also removed from your position pending a full independent review of the medical practices surrounding my family. As officials were arrested and evidence was secured, Marcus found himself standing beside Lyria, who had returned to her walker and was gripping it tightly to stay upright. You did it, Marcus said quietly. We did it, Lyria corrected, and her voice was growing stronger with use. You gave me my life back. Emperor Cassius approached them, and for a moment, Marcus thought he was about to be executed anyway, but instead the Emperor placed a hand on his shoulder. You were promised anything you desire if you succeeded, the Emperor said. Name your reward. Marcus thought about wealth and titles and all the things he could ask for, but when he looked at Lyria still struggling to stand but standing nonetheless, he knew what mattered. I want to continue this work, Marcus said. There must be other medical conditions that have been dismissed or ignored because the solutions are not elegant enough for the consortium, and I want to find them and fix them. That can be arranged, the Emperor said. I will establish the Imperial Institute of Practical Medicine with you as its director, and you will have whatever resources you require. And I want to remain Lyria's friend, Marcus added. If she will have me. Lyria smiled, and it was the first time Marcus had seen a real smile on her face. Always. The Emperor looked between them, and something knowing passed across his expression. I suspect friendship will only be the beginning. But yes, you have my blessing for whatever develops. In the weeks that followed, the conspiracy was fully exposed, and dozens of officials were arrested while the Galactic Medical Consortium faced investigations across multiple worlds. The revelation that human colonists had solved the problem that Galactic Medi